Hello, good listeners. Welcome to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, a show about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dick. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're continuing with part 2 of a 3-part conversation with Sean Patterson and his research on Nestor Makhno and the Makhnovist movement. We ended part 1 learning about how Makhno rose to power. In this episode, our conversation shifts to the Eichenfeld Massacre, a tragedy that sadly lives on among descendants of Mennonites killed on that dark day. If you've not heard part 1, you'll want to hear that first. You can find it online at mharchives.ca. Some years ago, you wrote a paper about the Eichenfeld raids and the ensuing massacre in that village. Can you give us a brief overview of what happened there?
Yeah, so on November 8th, 1919, Makhnovist troops and Ukrainian peasants from neighboring villages, they surrounded the Mennonite settlement of Eichenfeld. They blocked off all entrances. The occupiers went door to door and they murdered all male landowners and their sons. This resulted in a total of 84 people being killed that night. In the ensuing week, the Makhnovists also attacked other Mennonite villages in the same settlement or same colony. And so in total, there were 136 people who were murdered in this massacre. And in addition to that, there was a huge amount of rape of women and girls. The massacre itself was part of a larger pattern in 1919. In which, in a very small amount of time, there were quite a few Mennonite settlements attacked by Makhnovists in which massacres were carried out.
Earlier you mentioned that some of his disdain for Mennonites came from being lashed in the face by a Mennonite landowner. Presumably he was a laborer there. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I don't think he would have been hit by the landowner himself. It probably would have been a supervisor who actually would have been Ukrainian or Russian. In his account, he actually doesn't mention, you wouldn't even know it was on a Mennonite farm, except for the fact that it gives the last name of the landowner. And it's...
What was that last name?
Jansen. And I actually met the descendants. So we met. Her name's Margie Coop. She recently passed away. We forged a friendship over time. And it was very interesting because her family had very different stories. According to her family, Makhno was there, but he befriended her, I guess it would be her grandfather. And they played together as children. They also have a story of during the revolution itself in which the wife of the wife of her grandfather was being harassed by robbers, and Makhno intervened and told them leave her alone. So there's more. It's interesting how there's more of this positive experience coming from a Mennonite account. It's hard to know what is true, right? In these stories that you receive, both can be true, right? That yes, he did have a positive relationship with the grandfather of this woman as a child, and that he was also beat because. At that time and age, it was workplace abuse was very common. Right, wouldn't be unusual for that to happen. It was a way to enforce work discipline. In terms of Eichenfeld and the relationship, I never found any clear evidence that Makhno was present at any of these massacres in 1919. It's interesting that they in the Makhnovist sources. The massacres are not mentioned at all. In fact, Mennonites are not. The word Mennonite is not mentioned once in the sources. And there's no orders to destroy these villages, nothing. So this leaves a very big question mark for historians working with sources of how this actually happened. Why did it happen?
Can you give us a brief description of the visual wealth of Eichenfeld for Mennonites?
Well, Eichenfeld itself was part of a larger daughter colony. So that it owned a lot of land, and it was surrounded by poor Ukrainian villages. There's some evidence that there were, in village records not from the time, that there was some conflict over access to the water, access to timber by Ukrainian peasants, and then also the land leasing, the prices, right? But in terms of wealth, of visually how it looked, there is often talk of how the German homes were built well, they were clean, they were ordered, and then you contrast this to what some observers have said, sort of the more dirtier, chaotic Ukrainian villages, which is coming out of the poverty that existed there. That visual contrast, just for some of these peasants, day-to-day life, right? There would have been this kind of jealousy, resentment that builds up. Mennonites in many of these records talk about that. They talk about, we generated all this wealth and we have all this, and we created a world that attracts that resentment. Resentment is to me, as a historian, resentment is an extremely powerful force within history and how people behave. It's something that's needs to be paid attention to more.
And of course, we have the photographic record too of very wealthy-looking Mennonite estates and,
Yes.
and luxurious gardens and pristine teams of horses pulling beautiful wagons and so on. So there's that evidence as well.
Yes. That was more in the estates were not on the daughter colonies, but they were in more separate lands. But a lot of these Ukrainians would work on those farms, right? And this is where Makhno, as a child, worked on some of these estates.
And that's where you would have that perception of this, or this great contrast of immense wealth and impoverished peasants working for these wealthy estate owners.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important in terms of the wealth, the resentment. I think it's also important to point out that it's sometimes people will think that by pointing that out, it's saying, well, the Mennonites, they're at fault for this, right? It's not about them being at fault. They were operating within their own world and doing their best to survive. What it is, though, is showing that there were serious structural problems within the Tsarist empire to create that level of wealth discrepancy. It goes all the way back to serfdom and colonization and how socioeconomics developed. So it's not about blame. It's about understanding the structure of how things were set up to create those conditions.
That kind of chaos opens doors for opportunists, for looting and pillaging. Is that an oversimplified explanation for the raids that killed so many Mennonites in Eichenfeld, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I think that opportunism is part of the answer, but it's only a piece. The region's history had a lot to do with what happened. It was a colonized region. Catherine II, the Russian Tsar, she colonized southern Ukraine in the late 1700s. As part of that process, the Zaporizhian Cossacks, which lived in that region, well, some of them were killed, some of them were expelled, others co-opted into the government. So there were also Tatars that lived on the land. They were forced settled. And then foreign colonists were brought in to help colonize the region, develop the land. Mennonites were known as being excellent farmers. That's why they were invited to this region to help develop it. And they were very successful at that. But a part of being successful at that is that you begin to accumulate wealth in your hands. Serfdom had been also imposed in this region by Russia. The serfs were emancipated in 1862. However, part of that agreement to emancipate them was that they pay back for the land that they're given. So now they're taxed, they're becoming more impoverished, and there was a population boom as well. So then there's less land per person. So you have this crunch that's happening. And the landlessness crisis was also hit Mennonites, but they were able to purchase daughter colonies, they called them. So these were so that the landless population of the Mennonites was able to farm. They had set up their own farms. But these daughter colonies were bought up on land, often former Russian noble land, and where Ukrainian peasants previously worked it. So they had a relationship with the land and with the previous landlord that they were used to. Now it was different. Sometimes they didn't have access to the same waterways and timber that they used to. Sometimes they didn't have access to the same land, or they had to, or land was leased at a higher price. So there's these resentments within both the colonization of this region and the socioeconomics. That's one of the main sources of what happened at Eichenfeld is this sort of background knowledge to what was going on. The workplace abuse was something that comes up repeatedly in the sources. I'm sure also that simple personal grievances between people were part of this as well. That had nothing to do with politics and economics. It's just purely personal relations. I believe ideology played an important role as well. Ideology, what it does is that you don't have to have somebody that completely believes in the ideology as a fanatic, right? It creates a map, right? It's a mental map for navigating, and it creates the limits of what's permissible, what's not permissible. How can you rationalize things? What can't you rationalize under that worldview? So the ideology, the rhetoric of the time was extreme. It was on many sides, but Makhno's ideology was very violent, right? Its rhetoric was violent. They constantly used metaphors of extermination. And in this sense is how I would say how ideology contributed to what was going on. Ethnic hatred also did play a role. There's cases where there's testimony from survivors. There they say, the Makhnovists came to kill all Germans, or the Makhnovists said this themselves. The Makhnovists forbade that kind of attack based only on ethnicity. But what you see on the ground is people kind of combining ethnic and class hatred together. So you get these testimonies of people talking about, we're here to kill the German landowners. We're here to kill the Jewish exploiters. This kind of language, right, which melds ethnicity and class together. And so this is a component that also has to be looked at. If you're starting to combine ethnicity and class, it's then easy to extend that to entire communities. That these communities here, they're wealthy, they belong of a certain type, right? There was a phrase in Makhnovist literature they called the Mennonite and German colonies, they called them nests of the counter-revolution. So this is a case in which you're sort of seeing that extension of the enemy to an entire community. And just to point out that in Eichenfeld, it was the landowners specifically that were killed. But in other massacres, it was the entire communities, including children. So that's also a case of this sort of the ethnic hatred, the ideology combining and then spreading to community as a whole.
That was part 2 of my 3-part series speaking with historian Sean Patterson and his research on anarchist Nestor Makhno and Mennonites. Join us next week for part 3, where I ask Sean what Mennonites can or should be listening for in this tragic saga. The Mennonite Heritage Archives holds extensive collections related to Nestor Makhno, the Eichenfeld Massacre, and Sean Patterson's book, Makhno and Memory. To see photos related to this story or to listen to this series again, visit mharchives.ca. The Tales team welcomes your comments and questions about this program via email at info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Archivist Conrad Stace. The Mennonite Heritage Archives is a community-supported memory center that relies on donations from community members like you. To support this program and the preservation of Mennonite history, visit mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
Thanks to the Tales team of Conrad Stace and David Klippenstein. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back next week, concluding our 3-part series on Nestor Makhno and Mennonites. Thanks for listening.